Hi, welcome to friends old and new to our community conversation today. I'm Nicole Trimble. I lead Talent Rewire, and I'm thrilled to be collaborating with REDF and Unite-LA today to put on this very, very special conversation with Dr. Manuel Pastor and Amelia Ransom. I'm going to go as quickly as I can because we want to get to listening to them, but I want to put a few housekeeping things out there. First of all, this is being recorded. We'll send the recording out within the next couple of days, and hopefully if you enjoy it, you'll share it with people you know. There will be an opportunity to do Q&A in the later in the webinar, and so please use the chat and Q&A functions. Many of you, I think, are really accustomed to Zoom at this point and know how to use those, so please do that liberally. Holly Marsom from our team on the back end will be managing those and sharing those with Dr. Pastor and Amelia. And we'll also be having live tweeting. You can see down below the hashtags and our Twitter handles, and so feel free to add to the conversation. I just want to start by saying how humbled and grateful I am that you're all here for this conversation that we built in partnership with Unite-LA and REDF. And this really started because we started to say, what is it that employers need to do? And we know so many employers are looking to change their policies, their practices, how they're looking at their resources. But we really believe and came to this quote by James Baldwin that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And part of what we're here to do today is just talk about what is the data, what is the story, so that we can make the changes based on data, based on not just narrative, and move from there. And so with that, I'm thrilled to be able to pass the baton to our colleague Hetty now from Unite-LA, who will introduce our wonderful speakers.
Thank you, Nicole, and good morning, everyone. I'm Hetty Nam, Director of Workforce Development at Unite-LA, and along with REDF, who I'll talk about in a moment, we're the two local LA-based nonprofit organizations partnering with FSG Talent Rewire to bring this great program to employers in the LA area. REDF is a venture philanthropy that invests exclusively in social enterprises that employ and empower people overcoming barriers to work. And they've helped thousands of residents in LA County access employment. And REDF is proud to partner with forward-thinking organizations and corporations that are leading the way in social impact hiring and responsible procurement practices. Unite-LA has been a trusted business intermediary for over 20 years, dedicated to supporting the development of an effective public cradle-to-career education and workforce development system so that all Angelenos succeed in college, career, and beyond. From our work, REDF and Unite-LA know that despite the vast economic opportunity among LA's diverse industries, many communities are not able to connect to that opportunity because they experience systemic barriers to employment, and many families experience hardship and poverty despite their hard work. And that's why we're so excited to partner with FSG Talent Rewire to bring this programming that supports employers directly in dismantling those barriers to economic opportunity and mobility to build a more inclusive economy and region, which is even more relevant as we work through challenges posed by COVID-19's economic impacts. So now I'll introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Manuel Pastor, who is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He's the inaugural holder of the Terpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at USC and holds an economics PhD from UMass Amherst. He's also the director of USC's Program for Environmental and Regional Equity and the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. His research focuses on economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movement seeking to change those realities. Dr. Pastor speaks frequently on issues of demographic change, economic inequality, and community empowerment, and contributes opinion pieces to media outlets such as the LA Times, among many others. And he's on many boards and advisory commissions, actually including Unite-LA's board, and has won many awards in recognition for his research and work with communities. Among his speaking engagements, he frequently speaks with business leaders and chambers of commerce across the country, so we're really thrilled to have him with us today. Amelia Ransom, who will be joining the conversation after Manuel's initial presentation, is Senior Director of Engagement and Diversity at Avalara, a global tech firm providing financial services software, among other things. She's responsible for driving strategy and initiatives that impact, solidify, and improve company culture. She has over 29 years of experience building and executing strategy within human resources and business operations in world-class customer-centric businesses. Prior to joining Avalara, Amelia held multiple regional and company-wide leadership positions at Nordstrom, most recently as Director of Talent. Across her tenure at Nordstrom, she was responsible for the development and integration of the company's workforce diversity strategy for hiring and developing diverse talent, fostering an inclusive work environment, community outreach and engagement of students and millennials who represented the majority of Nordstrom's workforce, leadership development curricula and training content for over 74,000 employees, and directed HR strategy in a region with more than 5,000 employees. Amelia serves on many boards, including the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. She was raised in South Central LA, and she's familiar with our education system in the region and barriers to economic inclusion in LA. She now resides in Seattle, where she's been part of the Talent Rewire community as an economic and racial justice champion for many years. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Pastor.
Thank you, Eddie. Glad to be with everyone today, at least to Zoom with everyone today. Let me just bring up a PowerPoint, because what an academic presentation would be complete without one. So what I want to do in the few minutes that we have together before jumping into this conversation, I'm especially excited to be speaking with Amelia, both because of her many talents, but also because I think that my wife was, for her volume of expenditures, almost an investor in Nordstrom. So I'm going to try to see if I can get a little money back as I talk to Amelia about that. But what I want to talk about today is sort of the changing demography of Southern California and ways in which it's not changing. The state of inequality, and in particular racial inequality, and 3, why it is that we should be trying to do something about this, why it's in business interest, why it's in our social interest, and with Amelia, we'll talk a lot more about the kind of programs that can make a difference. So if you think about the news that normally gets broadcast around demographic change, a lot of it has to do with the national picture and the fact that the United States is slated to go from being about 69% non-Hispanic white in the year 2000 to about 47% non-Hispanic white in 2050. Excuse me, that is that by about the year 2043, 2044, the United States becomes majority people of color. Now, interestingly, California has, of course, crossed this threshold a long time ago. If you look at that data from 2000 to 2050, that's basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. And that means, in some sense, that California is America just sooner, something that the rest of the United States often doesn't like to hear, but in fact is the case. But there's something very important if you look at this data. You'll look at California and you note that as we go forward, our demographic change is actually slowing down somewhat. And if you look at LA County in particular, we became majority people of color in about the year 1987 or so. And we've are basically stabilizing as we move forward. So if you're thinking about the demography of the labor force in the future, it's the demography of the labor force today. And despite the national debate about what is driving that demographic change at the national level and at the state and local level, there's a couple of key things to know. It is no longer immigration that's driving that demographic change, particularly in Los Angeles and in California. And it's really the change in the youth population, that is, the new workers that will be entering into the labor force, that are driving that change. So if you look at immigration, for example, this is a kind of long-term view from 1860 to the current period. Interestingly, you'll see there was a big zoom up in Los Angeles and in California in terms of the share of the population that was immigrant or foreign born in the 80s and in the 90s. And in fact, in LA County alone, 25% of the nation's new immigrants in the 80s and the 90s were coming in through Los Angeles County. But that's changed dramatically. And as you can see, our peak for share of foreign born in Los Angeles was actually in 2000. It's been on the decline throughout the aughts and actually all through, certainly through the teens. What's going on is that our population is becoming much more, that is, population that's ethnic, Latino and Asian, is much more likely to be US born, to be homegrown. And that makes a difference in terms of where you think the labor force is coming from and the situation that people face. Doesn't mean that we don't have immigrants. What it does mean is that that immigrant population is much more long settled. So for example, if you look at the states in the United States, we can't do this by region, but look at the states. California has the most settled immigrant population of any state in the United States. Our immigrants, about 82% of them, have been in the country since 2004. And that's even true if you look at our undocumented immigrant population. So 70% of undocumented Angelenos have actually been in the United States for more than a decade or longer. Why? The undocumented population in the United States peaked in the year 2007, had a sharp decline between 2007 and 2009, has been on a slow decline since. That first sharp decline had to do with shifts in the economy, the Great Recession. That sort of long, slow decline from 2009 forward has nothing to do with enforcement at the border. It's got a lot more to do with the fact that fertility rates in Mexico have declined dramatically, so that's less of a push factor of new immigrants, and also the state of the Mexican economy. So we've got a much more settled undocumented population, much more likely now to be deeply embedded in our communities, deeply integrated into our economy, and also deeply impacting our family structures. So for example, in LA County, 18% of Angelenos are either themselves undocumented or live with a family member who is. So about 800,000 undocumented Angelenos, about 776,000 US citizens living with undocumented family members, another 250,000 lawful permanent residents, green card holders who also live with undocumented family members. This is important, particularly in the current situation, because there's no federal relief program for these undocumented immigrants. They're frozen out of unemployment insurance. And as many of you know, the previous CARES Act actually said that if you were an undocumented person and you were filing taxes with an individual taxpayer identification number, you couldn't receive the federal relief check. And if you were undocumented filing with an ITIN, individual taxpayer identification number, living with someone who was either an LPR or a US citizen, and they filed with a social security number because they're legally permitted to work. That entire married couple in the family unit, including the children, were frozen out of relief. This is a huge part of the Southern California economy, frozen out of the kind of current programs. It means we need to start thinking about that population. So demographic change has slowed down, but there's tremendous legacies from it. And the demographic change will continue in certain ways that people don't pay attention to. If you look at the share of people born in California who are still in California between the ages of 25 and 45, kind of prime working age, you'll notice these differentials by race. About 60% of whites in that age category who are born in California are still in California. About 70% of Black Californians, 79 and 82% of Latino and NA Asian Pacific Islander Californians. Why is this important for employers? This is evidence that people, particularly who are Black, Latino, and Asian, really want to stay in the state. So if you're doing your recruitment efforts, and we found this ourselves at USC, we just beat out the University of Chicago for a UCLA sociology PhD. And all of my colleagues were, gosh, we're sure we're going to lose her to the University of Chicago. And I said, no, she's Latina. She was undocumented for a period of time. She grew up in South LA. We have the ability to retain her because this population that grew up in LA really wants to stay in LA. Another key demographic trend is that actually our child population is decreasing. It's again, most people when they think about demography, they think about the past instead of what's currently going on. So there's this sense that the Latino youth population is growing. In fact, it's shrinking and has been since the mid-aughts. It's one of the reasons why we've got some issues with school sizes. But what that means is that every young person is that much more precious to the productivity of our economy going forward. So I hope by looking at this demography, I've convinced you that there's some new trends and also that our young people are tremendous assets for us going forward, something that I will pay a little bit more attention to in the second part of this presentation. Because even as this demographic trend has been going on, we've had a couple of really unsettling economic trends. One is the widening wage divide between those at the top and those at the bottom of the wage distribution. So this looks at how people are doing at the 90th percentile. 10% make more money, 90% make less. The 80th percentile, 20% make more, 80% make less. The middle, and then kind of going down to the 20th and 10th percentile. What you'll notice is a trend for the gray bars for the United States that everybody's familiar with, which is the widening gap in terms of wages for those at the top, and those at the bottom. But you're going to notice that that trend in California is basically on steroids. That what we can see in California is that the divides are even sharper. And while that's important, that there's a shift in the distribution for those at the top and the bottom, a lot of which has to do with education, which I'll get to in a minute, it's also the case that there's just tremendous loss for the average worker. What this does is compare productivity in the United States and in California to hourly compensation. You'll see that for the United States, 72% increase in worker productivity, 14% increase in hourly compensation. What's interesting in California is there's been a very sharp increase in the income or the productivity of workers in California, but basically their wages have flatlined over the same period of time. So it's not just that there's shifts in the distribution of wages and income, it's that the average worker has lost out as the economy has improved its productivity over time. And that big imbalance between labor and business is part of what's giving rise to the populist impulse that exists right now. There's a sharp racial divide in terms of prosperity. And what you can see looking at here is the share of full-time workers making less than $15 an hour in the Los Angeles metro. And this is comparing men and women by ethnicity. What the big thing you can see here is that there's a very big gap in terms of those making less than $15 an hour between Black full-time workers and white full-time workers. But the biggest group making less than $15 an hour in the Los Angeles metro is Latino and Latina workers. So you can see a very sharp racial divide. And it would be comforting for many of us if that racial divide was simply a result of education. So let me show you what that looks like. This is median wages by education level in using 2016 dollars for the age group 25 to 64. I'm using 1990 data here. You might say, Professor Pastor, that's really old data. Why are you using it? I'll show you why in just a second. But what you can see here is a message that perhaps your parents told you, which is that getting educated is generally better for you as you move from the less educated group, less than high school diploma, to having a BA or higher. You could see that wages go up, and they go up for each groups. But in 1990, there were pretty big gaps between white and Black workers, white and workers of color at each and every level of education. Of course, what we would have hoped is that as we got to the current period, that those wage gaps would have shrunk, that the work that we've done to equalize the way in which employers treat workers of similar education levels would have made a difference. So let me show you the same chart for 2014 to 2018 using the same scales. It's pretty disappointing. I'll go back. You'll see that it's the same basic message, more education. But you're going to see that with the exception of highly educated Asian workers, for the most part, the racial wage gaps by education have actually increased in this period of time, something that signals evidence of continuing and perhaps worsening racial discrimination in labor markets, something I know that Amelia has done a lot of work to try to ameliorate in the way that employers treat workers coming from different communities. And one of the challenges with this is that this is something that's being baked into our future. This is one of my favorite graphs, not because it makes me happy, but because of the story that it tells. This is median household income by race and ethnicity. And you can see a pattern that most of us are familiar with, which is that white households have higher median household income than Black and Latino households. And in the Southern California situation, higher incomes than Asian American households as well. The next chart I'm about to show you, same scale, same ethnic breakdown, but I'm going to focus in on households who have children living with them who are under the age of 5. And what you're going to notice is that the household gaps are even sharper. Focus in on Black and Latino households, the income levels are about the same, but for white households and Asian households with children under 5, the income gaps are even larger. What that means is that we're structuring in, we're baking in inequality going forward. And this is also evident when you look at the share of children who go to high poverty schools, that is schools where more than 75% of the children are on free and reduced price lunch. Now, not all high poverty schools are bad schools. My own children went to such schools, partly because my wife taught in such schools, and we thought that we should put our children where our values were. They did fine. That is, they went to UCLA. Of course, one is a now a musician and another is a yoga instructor. So I'm not sure how that actually all worked out, but they did wind up going to pretty good colleges. But you can see that in the Los Angeles metro area, only about 10% of white kids go to high poverty schools, but 61% of Black kids and 67% of Latino kids go to high poverty schools. And by the way, that disparity is now worse than it was even just a couple of weeks ago. And again, looking at the current situation, this is looking at workers by race and ethnicity, whether they've got essential jobs that are pretty high risk where they need to go, or they've got non-essential jobs, pretty high risk, where they might have gotten laid off. And the interesting thing to notice here is that particularly for Black and Latino workers, they're concentrated both in the jobs where they need to go, which means they're more likely to catch COVID, and they're also concentrated in the jobs where they're more likely to have been laid off. That may seem like a bit of a contradiction for many of you thinking about it initially, but this combination of more likely to get sick and more likely to get laid off is something that's afflicting our Black and Latino populations. Doesn't need to be this way, and there's big gains to be made. If we could reduce and eliminate the racial disparities in terms of income by both closing the education gap and closing the sort of discrimination and documentation gap that's contributing to racial disparities, that could be a $350 billion a year boost to the local Los Angeles economy, something that's, of course, nothing to sneeze at. The problem is that we've got a lot of issues that are baking inequality in, and I want to be respectful of time, and I'll jump over these and do the typical thing of actually sneaking them into the Q&A. But what I do want to do is lift up those three lessons at the bottom, that we need to do something that I think is often very hard for Americans, which is to hold three ideas in our head at the same time. That is that we need to lift the bottom by things like increasing the minimum wage, making sure that there's equitable education, and a number of things like making sure there's full access to health insurance and healthcare, et cetera. So we need to lift the bottom. We need to grow the middle. We need to concentrate on those kind of jobs that do have paths to mobility that exist in the middle of the economy, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and we need to drive the top. We need to make sure that we're doing well on high-end healthcare jobs, on the entertainment industry as well. Combining all those things, there's nothing contradictory between lifting the minimum wage and making sure that we're getting high-end industry that can help be an export industry moving things forward. Most of all, we need to make sure that equity is baked in, not sprinkled on. We can't create an economic package for Southern California and then look at the damage we've caused and try to clean it up later. And third, we need to model new forms of collaboration and problem solving, in particular, new forms that say that we need to center racial equity in our economic strategies. We need to center racial equity in our business and civic conversations, and we need to center racial and other equity in what our businesses do internally to try to address some of the challenges that we face. So let me close with that. I guess I'm really closing by advertising my book, State of Resistance, and also a project we did from resistance to renewal, a 12-step program for innovation and inclusion in the California economy. But with that, I will stop the screen share and turn things over for the conversation.
Well, Dr. Pastor, I will never tire of listening to you talk about what is happening in a community that I care about so much. As you mentioned, I'm from South Los Angeles. Shout out to LA. For those that think I went straight from California to Seattle, which was a typical route for people, I took the long way by going to the East Coast and the Midwest. And then after college, I went to Pepperdine and then coming to Seattle. But it struck me as I was listening to you talk, and I've gone on and sort of internet stalked you in a way and listened to a lot of your presentations online. what I didn't have words for until just now is that it is rare for me to hear someone give this level of detail around the facts of things that are happening in our community without demonizing the people, without objectifying the people that are part of that data. And so I just want to first say thank you. I appreciate it. I couldn't actually put words to that until just a minute ago when I was listening to you talk, because what that allowed me to do was sort of put my shoulders down and really listen to what you were saying and really hear that and start to think about solutions for what's happening in the community. So thank you for that. That was pretty fantastic. I appreciate that. So it's great to be here with you. Hi, everyone. I'm Amelia.
I'll say a word about that, Amelia, which I think is so important, which is we need to ground this conversation in data, which is why I start there. Incontrovertible realities about who the next workforce is, who the next set of consumers are, what America is going to look like, and the fact that this is a welcoming, creative, and really optimistic opportunity for us to be able to move in. And at the same time that I point out some of those hard-hitting realities in terms of the wage divide, in terms of how workers have slipped, around the persistent racial discrimination that exists in labor markets, that we need to invite people into this conversation. Because if we make every one of these conversations so painful that you don't want to come back to it, that you don't know what you can do, you don't know how you can address it, you don't feel like you are part, not of just the problem, but of the solution, then you're not going to come back. And we need business to come back. We need white people to understand the centrality of anti-Black racism in our country. We need other people of color to understand how anti-Black racism has structured the terrain of racial inequality on which immigrants find it difficult to move ahead. And that unless we tackle the situation that's been confronting Black Americans for decades and centuries, we're not really going to get immigrants moving into the American dream either. So I appreciate that you understand what is a pretty conscious strategy about how to bring people in.
I think that's right. I want to start with a question. And it might seem like I'm going straight to Final Jeopardy with this question. What's at risk? What's really at risk here? If we don't figure out how to create an inclusive economy, if we don't understand that we're really all in this together, if businesses don't understand that we have, these aren't my words, that businesses have entered the social contract. We have entered the social construct. And in fact, we were always there. What's at risk?
Well, I think, there's two things at risk. One is our fundamental humanity and connection to one another, and how we think about ourselves as decent human beings in mutual relationships with other folks. There's also a lot of economic risks. Our research has shown that those regions that are more equitable, less racially segregated, and less politically fragmented, which is a result of inequality and racial segregation, are actually able to sustain job growth over time. Now you might look at me and think, well, this is some lefty professor trying to sell you some regression he came up with. He's from California. He probably did it in a hot tub. And of course, as you know, because you're from Los Angeles, particularly South LA, that all the people from UCLA are already doubters and haters already because it's a professor from USC. So don't believe me, believe those crazy left institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve, which have also looked at these issues and said that we've put our economies at risk by perpetuating such a high level of inequality. And you know what? It's easy to think about even anecdotally. So let me just say, if you think about the problem of over-policing and over-incarceration, it's a racial justice issue to be sure. But just think about the tremendous talent you're wasting by attaching a criminal record to 25% of young Black men who are in the labor force who are then finding it difficult to maximize their contribution to your business because of the way in which they've been over-policed and over-incarcerated. And I think business really needs to shift its attitude. The thing that always strikes me, when people, for example, speak about a town close to South LA, Compton, they tend to have a kind of negative image of what might come out of Compton. But when you start to think about the fact that the Williams sisters and Kendrick Lamar and Ava DuVernay and Richard Sherman and Dre and so much, and Asia Brown, the new mayor, who's really dynamic,
Yes.
has all this stuff is coming out of Compton. There's this just tremendous creativity there that's going to waste when you've got a system that doesn't recognize that talent and that over-polices and over-incarcerates at a systemic level. And I just think that the kind of political tension as well that results from people being frozen out doesn't allow us to come to consensus on the right kind of growth strategies.
I think that's true. And I think one of the things, you're talking about a lot of the people in the communities, many people that have strong opinions on these communities have never been to them, have never experienced them, have never seen the people who live in such communities. I tell people I'm from South Los Angeles and they've already got an idea in their head that, I don't know who my father is, that, I struggled, that I didn't have shoes, that I didn't go to school and I wasn't loved and all of these things. And none of that is true. My parents owned the home that we grew up in. I had lots of love. I even became a debutante. Please do not judge me for this. But, and was educated, along the way and went to really great schools and had really great educators. And so I think the risk to business is that we have an idea in our head that really isn't true. We have to dismantle the notion that what we think we see on TV and in movies, and that one time I went to one friend's house, my college roommate's house in that neighborhood, that isn't representative of entire communities of people. And that, I think, is where business starts, where we have to say it's really important that we understand that this narrative around community is not a monolith.
Well, and I would just add to that business also gets involved in dismantling the structural barriers. So it's a little, it's a question of looking past. There's some really good research on the fact that if you take exactly the same resume and put a black sounding name on it versus a white sounding name on it, there's about half the callbacks on exactly the same resume. No other information except the names. And this was done, by the way, a study that was done by conservative economists at the University of Chicago. So there's issues of what employers are looking at. There's also structural barriers as well. Those structural barriers have to do with the education systems and whether or not we're getting the right kind of resources to them. They have to do with the issues of over-policing and over-incarceration that I mentioned. They have to do with a broken immigration system in which there's tremendous creative talent of people who have been in the country for a very long time, are highly committed to it, would be quite willing to scale up the small businesses that they've actually started already, could contribute if all these issues of legal status were pushed to one side. I want to flip the script, Amelia, and ask you, what do you think, how do you think business should lead in this space?
One, I think that it's important, as we're talking about entering the social construct, I think it's important that businesses understand they have a role to play in dismantling racism, anti-immigrant. They have an actual role to play, and their role is not, well, I hire great people and I provide a living wage. That is not just the role of business. The role of business many times can shape the narrative for communities. I'm on the board of Seattle Goodwill, and our motto is jobs change lives. And, that is true, but they also change generations. They also have the opportunity to change lots of things. So I think there are really practical ways that businesses can lean in and get involved. One is what you're talking about in terms of resumes. How do we look at resumes? What does good look like? There was a study in 2014 that said, 75% of white Americans do not actively engage with anyone non-white. They don't have a non-white friend. What does that mean? That means that many people network their way into jobs. Most people on this call, most people are not just applying for jobs and getting jobs. You're networking into jobs. You're networking into internships. That's that leg up that we're talking about that our communities aren't receiving because we're not at the table to give them. So businesses can really think about, what does that mean? When I have standard processes, policies that I follow, I make it more equitable. But I also need to think about when I'm going to hire a person for a role, and I can't define what good looks like in that role absent another person, meaning, oh, just go get me another Dr. Pastor. That's what I'm looking for. Well, I'd love to wake up tomorrow with your brain, but I probably will still wake up tomorrow with my brain. So
Beautiful brain.
Well, but what does that mean? What are the skills I'm looking for? Because as you talked earlier about skills and education, what does it mean for an employer to think about skills they're looking for? Of course, we want to fix the educational system, and of course, we want more people to be educated. But absent that, are there transferable skills that someone may have received while incarcerated, that someone may have received on another job that could transfer into the role that you think requires an MBA?
Yeah, Google is launching a very interesting program right now with regard to allowing people to train and move their way into a certificate for programming that doesn't rely on a formal education. That's going to be especially important for people, for example, in the Central Valley and poor communities in Southern California too. You know, I would add a couple things. I'm actually also looking at the chat here that I think is kind of important. One is that I think another way that business can lead, it's in your own individual employer practices, but another way is to recognize some externalities. And by that, what I mean, you know, when you think about high-tech information businesses, which of course we're all trying to attract, that was a point I was going to make, is that they also bring with them a lot of low-paid, currently low-paid service jobs. Because behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and gardeners and food service workers. And we forget that the innovation economy is an economy that actually also includes a lot of service work, and therefore there's no contradiction between business saying we want to drive our way to make sure that we've got the packages that bring high tech and entertainment and information to a locale, and we need to improve the wages of the service workers and retail workers that are part of making sure that those industries thrive as well. And we need to fight hard for the kind of affordable housing for low income people, because another thing that happens when you do that kind of development, we've seen it in Southern California, is it drives up the price of housing right nearby and has a huge impact on communities. So I think it's sort of taking a kind of whole economy approach in terms of what you're responsible for. Two other things have come up in the chat which I think are really interesting. One is, if you solve for Black people, you solve for everyone. If you ban the box, lots of white people benefit from that as well. And I think there's so many different circumstances in which that's true. Someone else raised something about the wages for Latinos. We can separate those by documentation status as well. And certainly lack of legal status contributes to the wage retrogression for Latinos. But it's still there even for US born. So these are issues we need to address.
I think you're right. I think, you know, I would add on to what you're saying about, you know, when you solve for Black people in a way, we also have to continue to measure that the way that we're enforcing or implementing practice and policies actually affect the people we're trying to affect. Because it's true that many practices and policies will affect and be beneficial for communities of color and also beneficial for other communities as well. It's important, I think, over time, and you'll probably have lots of data to support this, that we have to keep our foot on the gas on that and make sure that how we actually go about implementing those policies is really working in the best way for communities of color, not just theoretically, but really in practice, that they're very supportive of those communities. Because sometimes the message gets away from us. The project or the program gets away from us, and it ends up serving a majority community read affirmative action that really benefits more white women than it's ever benefited else. So how do we ensure that those things work as well? I would say also to your comment around, or the comment that is probably in the chat that I haven't like fully read yet, around pay gap is absolutely true, but we can't just stop at the pay gap. You have to then look at the opportunity gap within your company. You know, the pay gap is really, okay, there are 500 CEOs of, you know, Fortune 500 companies. One of them is a woman. I'm making these numbers up, but one of them is a woman. The first is like, okay, is that one woman paid what the 499 men are paid? The second is, how come there's only one woman?
Yeah.
Right? And what are all the barriers that keep that other women in that example from rising and becoming CEOs themselves? What are the systemic things that are happening? And so a lot of companies are taking this view of, I want to look at the pay gap. I want to add up what everybody's earning, divide it in half and see where it comes out, and not really looking internally at the systems and practices that keep Black people, that keep Latinx people, that keep women from becoming those roles. And I think as someone in a business, I think about it in terms of the garden, the grocery store, and the restaurant, because I have an analogy for everything. My example is like, you have to be planting as a business everywhere. There are times you need to go plant in the garden. You were talking about this earlier, like what's gonna happen to the new young people? Every young person in Southern California is so precious because there are fewer of them. So how do you go as a business and plant in the garden, in schools, in community? How do you go to the grocery store? Meaning like if you're hiring, okay, I know how to go and like get somebody with potential and put something together and help them actualize. And then of course there are times you're like, I'm going to a restaurant, I need to hire somebody quickly. Yeah. But if you're a business and you really understand what your role is in community, you understand you need to invest in all three of those areas.
I think it's really important, and I think it's also figuring out how to have an eye for talent where people don't always see talent. And I know you've done it, I know I've done it, and then the results are just tremendous. You're just in awe of what's resulted. I think the other thing I would lift up, because when we sort of talked about this, you know, the murder of George Floyd lifted up a moment in which people are talking about race and racism in ways that they were not before. And I think there's a couple of key things about this moment. First is there's been a bit of a realization, but we need to keep it there, which is that policing is just the tip of a racist iceberg, that beneath that are disparities in the economy, in education, even in the environment, and we need to tackle all of those structural disadvantages that we then try to solve at the end with policing that winds up being brutal and insensitive. I think the second thing I would really encourage is that this conversation about race and racism, and by the way, notice that I'm saying both, because I think people want to have a conversation about race, which is a little bit like, Amelia, when we first met, I asked you, not just are you from South LA, but what street you grew up on, because I know enough to know it makes a difference, and I'm interested in your history and your culture and your background. That's not the same thing as talking about racism. Racism is talking about structural disadvantage and how do we do something about it. And key to that, I think, is learning to do more of it. The analogy I use with audiences is to say, well, how many of you go to the gym? Normally, and I hate having to do this on Zoom because I can't see your reactions, but in an audience, when I say, how many of you go to the gym? Some people raise their hand enthusiastically because they actually do. Some others bring their hand up just like this because they know that they go to the gym, but it's like every once in a while. And I turn to them and I say, well, you know that when you go to the gym just every once in a while, it hurts. Your muscles ache. You make mistakes and drop weights on your foot. Nobody in the gym wants to help you because they haven't seen you and they know you're not coming back. They know it's probably January and you just made a New Year's resolution, which you're not going to keep. Not talking about race and racism every day is like going to the gym every once in a while or going just as part of your New Year's resolution in January. You're going to make mistakes. It's going to hurt. You're not going to want it to come back. But if you create a space within your organizations to keep the conversation going, to say systematically what's wrong with what we're doing, how do we address it, and how do we lose our fear of talking about it? Part of it is trying to make it welcoming, as you were pointing out. Part of it is making it persistent. And that's a central message that I would leave people with.
I love when we were having our prep call, we both had these fitness analogies, which I thought was pretty fantastic. I do. Inside my organization, I say all the time, we need to be at the gym in July. This isn't about the gym in January. We need to be at the gym in July. And the one way, because I've had people say, well, when are we going to stop, having this conversation about, are we still going to be talking about racism? I'm like, well, yes, if you are trying to be fit and you're always trying to be better, you will continue not just to talk about it, but you will continue to try new things to be better at it, to do it better, to get a better result. Of course we will. This is not a crash diet. This is not a pill that you're going to buy off the television at 3 a.m. You know that pill's not going to work. You know when you buy it, it's not going to work. But
go ahead.
There are two ways, I would say, there are two ways to make squats stop hurting. You can either keep doing them or stop doing them. But to your point about race and racism, if your goal is to make the squat stop hurting, that's race. Racism is, I want to be better. My goal is not the squat. My goal is to be better. So we're going to keep having not just the conversation, but taking the actions that make us better and make us more fit and healthy as a corporation, but also as a society. Sorry, Holly came in to check us.
I would just add one thing as we turn to Holly, because as you knew from the prep session, it's impossible to stop Amelia and I once we start talking. I was asked the other day, Amelia, in a kind of strategic planning thing, like, well, what's your personal vision of utopia 20 years from now? You wake up and what are you doing 20 years from now? And I gave an answer which I think surprised a lot of people. I said, 20 years from now, I hope I'm protesting. Because I didn't know 40 years ago that I would be in favor of trans rights. I didn't know that. It wasn't part of the way I was thinking about things. And now I realize how fundamentally unfair it is that transgender folks are not given full access to opportunities, respect, and dignity. I didn't know as much about disabilities. I can name the different things that I've grown. And I hope that we keep practicing every day. So 20 years from now, we're finding yet another injustice that we want to tackle. That maybe, I hope, we've made so much progress on racial injustice that that's not the one we're talking about, but that we found another way to perfect our union.
So one question, and thank you so much, Dr. Pastor, for doing my job and running through the chat and the Q&A. Really appreciate that. Just to wrap this up, I mean, both of you, if you could share like one tip to get to the gym. What's the first exercise, if not the squat? What's the first step our employers on our call might consider taking to get those muscles moving?
Listen, I would tell you that one thing that not just employers as a whole, but leaders within companies need to understand is if they think the problem is out there somewhere, it's not. The problem is inside your organization. Racism exists inside your organization. Anti-Blackness exists inside your organizations. It does. The problem is not out there. If you're in a place that I'm sitting today in Seattle, which is so liberal and so progressive and so whatever, and we like to thumb our nose at other cities because, well, at least we're not them. The problem is here too. I've lived in every quadrant of this country, and I've had more racist experiences in Seattle than I have where I've lived anywhere else. The problem is here too. And so If that doesn't cause you, if you could know that, and in the face of that think, I still don't need to go to the gym. If you want to stop talking about this, what I tell people, if you want to stop talking about it, be better at it. That's the way to get me to stop talking about it. The day that I don't have to worry that someone I love who hasn't called me back or texted me back is just, I can just assume they're okay. That would be a wonderful day to just sleep through the night and not worry about Black people all around the world. So that's the way I think employers can get involved, is not to think of themselves as an employer, but a collection of people inside an organization. It's not just that one entity moving as an organism. It's lots of leaders that make that up. And because humans are imperfect, we're bringing that into the workplace. And we have to be able to call that out and not put a blanket over everything and think that, if I think about anti-Blackness, that white women's experience is the same as a Black woman's experience. Those are different things, and we have to be able to have those conversations that lead to actions inside the company.
So I'll add just a couple things. Secondly, about what employers can do as civic leaders. But I just want to, say, I think on the internal side too, is recognizing what some of your employees might be going through. When Amelia just talked about worrying about family members, thinking about the stress and tension that the daily experience of being Black in the United States brings to people. Even a very sensitive employer, I remember the day after Trump got elected, I assembled my staff, many of the millennials. They were looking to me for inspiration and hope. And what I said was, I think it's going to be worse than you think, which, by the way, turned out to be a very accurate prediction. But what I forgot was a third of my staff has undocumented family members and live in sheer terror about what's happening every day for immigrants in the United States. That's a lot of stress for people to be going through. What I think employers can do as civic leaders is, I would label as data, determination, and destiny. Collect the data, ground the conversation, as I tried to, in incontrovertible facts about the racial disparities that exist, both in the broader society and maybe within your own organization. Second, determination. Really have the will, power, and show the leadership to do something about it. Say it's important, lift it up constantly, really lead. And third, create a sense of common destiny. Point out why, unless we do something about this, it's not just bad for the communities that are on the short end of this income and opportunity inequality gap, but it's actually bad for everyone to be living in that kind of society, particularly when you start thinking about productivity, wealth, and consumer demand going forward. So grounded in data, be determined to do something about it, and create a sense of shared destiny, because it is profoundly the disconnection in our society that leads to these problems. When you don't think about the terror of over-incarceration, it's just a huge, or poverty or homelessness. That's only possible when you feel disconnected from the people who are experiencing it.
Thank you. And what a wonderful segue. In our remaining minute, I have an invitation to extend to employers. If you want to continue the conversation, if you want help digging into that data, creating and joining a community of support to help you get to that level of determination and feeling that sense of community, then join us for 2 opportunities for accelerators. One kicks off in August for Southern California-based employers. The other kicks off in October for employers based anywhere in this country. And it's an opportunity for HR leaders, DEI leaders, CSR leaders to come together in community to assess their data and really ask these hard questions and figure out a plan forward and a path forward. You can find out more on our Talent Rewire website. Thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Pastor and Amelia Ransom, for your insights, for your time. It was wonderful. For those who joined us today, thank you for your time as well. I hope you had the opportunity to learn something new and to test some assumptions that you hold. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.